Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LEC Spring Split Week number 3 overview and analysis video. Again, thank you guys for kind of sticking through this. I know this video is coming out a little bit later than it normally would, but a lot's going on in the real world right now, and so I do appreciate your patience. This is unfortunately coming out after day number 1 of week number 4, and so there are going to be some overlaps in terms of some of the games that have been played, but we'll be covering, of course, week 4 in the week 4 video. We're here to cover week number 3, which is everything that happened last weekend. If you are excited, let me know down in the comment section below. Always curious to know where you guys land, but without further ado, let's get into some of the content, shall we? If you are new to the channel, what we're going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team is able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, I will also be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 10, and I will be talking about where I think teams are headed in terms of their trajectory. Right now, the middle of the LEC is one gigantic pot of soup that is very difficult to try and decipher. I think a lot of things are pretty wide open for quite a few teams. Remember, it's not like the previous splits where you got to be top 8 in order to make playoffs. You got to be top 6 now, and that makes things a lot more challenging for a lot of teams at this level, so I'm excited to go over it. But without further ado, let's get into the content itself, and that means starting off with day number 1 in our first series of week number 3, and that was a matchup between Team BDS and Team Heretics that kicked off this week number 3, and kind of shockingly, at least to me, Heretics is going to pick up the victory in a 2-1 series win. This shouldn't be that big of an upset. There are really good players on Team Heretics, but I just didn't think that they were going to be able to piece together any sort of consistency. I've pretty, consistently, I guess you should say, put the number 5, 6, and 7 teams in one grouping, so GIANTX, BDS, and Vitality kind of in their own little tier, and then Heretics I've always thought was kind of closer to being where Rogue and SK are, as a team that can theoretically cause some upsets, can be interesting in some series, but just aren't going to be able to find any sort of like game-to-game consistency to be able to win enough to be able to get them up into that top 6. That might not be the case, man. Like, this Heretics team has a lot going for them, and I think it is the places we expected, but also some of the places we didn't, and I'm excited to go over that. For BDS, this is just a bad loss. You played really well throughout a majority of this series. Game number 1 was probably a game you could have won. Game number 2, you definitely felt like the better team, and then, game number 3 kind of collapsed around you, and there's obviously a couple of more notable places to point your finger. Irrelevant and 1-1-3 on the top side are definitely going to be the ones that I focus on here because they lost the hardest, but Heretics did earn this victory. I'm not trying to say that BDS kind of got slighted by not winning. They threw it away. They should have had this, and they didn't, so let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series to me, pretty obviously, is going to go to Flakked in the bot lane. I've been a big Flakked defender for a very long time on this channel, as basically everybody knows. Basically, ever since he left G2, when he came back to Heretics, kind of replacing Jack Spectra, I felt like he was immediately a huge upgrade in the bot lane, and I like Jack Spectra. I think he's a very good player, was a very good player. He's a very good broadcaster now, but I think that Heretics made a good decision to kind of build around him and utilize his ability to play through lane and play through team fights to be able to try and bring in some younger talent. He's not a superstar. He's not going to be able to guide that transition as well as somebody like Elyoya did last year, for example, because I do think it is kind of a similar ask. Shea was obviously a decently experienced player, but he is the veteran on this team, the franchise player, and it's not necessarily worked out, but when you can get him into a good spot, he can still take over games, and what I think is really impressive for me is that Flakked was kind of known for a lot of these hyper carries for a long time, for playing Kai'Sa, for playing Kog'Maw. Like, those are the things that I kind of thought of with Flakked, and maybe not so much on G2 because he was more of a weak side bot, on G2, but in terms of Flakked as a player, I think of hyper carries, and that's not what he's been at all on Heretics, and that's not where he found success in this series. The Varus was awesome, and Varus can still be a gigantic problem, but it was the Ashe in game number 3 that really sealed the deal for me. Flakked's just really, really good. I think people continuously underrate him because he's not been on successful teams. I think his individual performances and like watching the tape, it definitely is up there with a lot of the upper tier 80 carries in the region. He just doesn't have the same kind of opportunity that those guys have, and that's what makes this position so hard to play in the LEC, is there's just such a breadth of talent at this position. It's very hard for one to be significantly way better than the other. Even in this series, can you say that Flakked was definitively better than Ice, who was really good? It's hard to say that. Like, Flakked was very good, but so was Ice, and so it's just hard to break out in the AD carry role, but Flakked's definitely giving it his best shot. Outside of that, Carlson has really started to improve at like a steady rate. I've been impressed with some individual performances from Carlson, a game here, a game there. You can kind of take some good and some bad from his tape, but overall there has been some concerning traits in terms of consistency, and I definitely think there's been more bad than good. That's not been as true so far in spring. He's definitely notably better in spring than he was in winter, and that is a very exciting prospect. He was definitely better than Irrelevant in this series, and that's not the first time I've said that about Carlson this split. Again, Camelou, I think it's going to take some more time for him to come along and be more consistent. Again, his highs are high and his lows are the lowest of anybody in the league, but Carlson, I think, is somebody who has enough experience under his belt to be able to make those adjustments, and clearly they're being made. He's not just surviving on the top side, he's actively starting to generate leads consistently, and that's a big plus because Sheo is already a very smart and a very calculated player that's been way more important to this team than he's getting credit for. Stend, I think, has had some ups and downs, of course, as any rookie is going to, but the ups still look really good. He's a very good engaged threat, and even if he's not consistent from a game-to-game basis, you're going to get some highlight plays out of him. Camelou is Camelou. He's way too important to this team for him to ever really be as inconsistent as he actually is, and he's going to naturally kind of halt the upward trajectory of Heretics, but like there is plenty here. If Carlson, Sheo, and Flacket are all, average or above average players in their position at the LEC level, this team can make top 6. That is definitely a strategy that can work out. We just saw BDS has been a pretty decent team over the course of this split, and they took them down. Like, maybe they weren't better throughout the entire series, but they certainly stepped up when it mattered, and that's really what counts at the end of the day. But for BDS on the other side, it's a very easy, conversation to have about where this team went wrong in this series. 113 is going to get dud of the series. I think you could theoretically give this to Irrelevant, who was also awful down the stretch here, but really this is a 113 kind of mistake series, and it's so frustrating because it finally felt like he was starting to piece together something game over game. I talked in winter about how his, performances every so often were pretty solid, but he just couldn't really put everything together. It felt like he was always missing one part of the game, and he would have a couple of series where things weren't working out. Again, kind of what I've talked about with some of the players on Heretics side, earlier on in this segment, but man, it really felt like things were clicking at the beginning of spring. He was a big reason why I put BDS all the way up at number 5 and felt comfortable there. Of course, Nuke is actually playing like an MVP frontrunner right now in terms of the gameplay he's putting out. He wasn't quite that in this series. He still was good, but you would have expected to beat Camelou a little bit harder. And then Ice was terrific here. It feels like he is once again starting to find his footing in the late games of some of these fights. Game 2 was awesome, I would say, from Ice on the Sivir, and I'm not a Sivir fan, but I think he did a great job of being able to take advantage of that. Even Paris, I think, is really starting to get a lot more comfortable at this level, and his engages are becoming a little bit more active. He's not quite as much of a passenger as he was in the winter split, which is nice, but if the top side is going to be inconsistent, that's a huge issue. 113 feels very feast or famine at this level. I expected something a little bit better from him, but maybe we could have guessed this because he was so much of a carry threat at the LFL level last year. One of the big reasons why I was so excited about 113 coming into this year is how well he played in Tier 2 last year. It just doesn't seem to be able to translate when you're playing against smart junglers game in and game out. Sometimes it will, and sometimes it won't. I think the aggressiveness is both a blessing and a curse for his game, and overall it's going to give him pluses and minuses, but Irrelevant has just been a minus. Like, as much as we can talk about how 113 was on a good trajectory and then was worse than anybody else in this series, I can't remember the last time I looked at an Irrelevant game and went, oh, you're actually doing the right thing and playing well. This guy has been awful over the course of 2025, and I'm freaking out about him. Like, I'm hitting the panic button on the Irrelevant stocks because I just think they are going completely out the window. It's not just, he looks disconnected, he's not playing well for a specific reason. Like, it feels like the skills have not translated over to this year. He's losing in lane. He's not doing anything in team fights. When you have a player like Carlson that's kind of running you on the map, that is a huge issue. That's a red flag, and they need him to step up. Again, he was supposed to be Adam, but without the baggage. He has been Badam and nothing else, and that is a big problem for BDS. And so again, I think this team can be really good. Nuke is incredible, and he's playing really well. Ice is really starting to get into form, but if it's just those two and maybe like half of Paris, that's not good enough. Like, this team is not going to be able to be top 6 with that, although they could be if you just get one of those players to stabilize, notably 113. And then it's kind of the same story for Heretics. Carlson, Blackid, Sheo are good enough as a trio to be able to compete for top 6. If you get Stend or Camelou to lock in, this team could be top 5. Like, that is how small the difference is between a lot of the teams in the middle of the standings right now, and I think that's what makes this split of the LEC so interesting. Then moving on now to our second series of day number 1, and it was a pretty easy to predict matchup between G2 Esports and Rogue that of course G2 was going to be able to pick up the victory in, and quite frankly they didn't do it in particularly difficult fashion. They dominated this series as they absolutely should. For as funny as Rogue is as a team in terms of what they are and what they're capable of, they're just not complete under any aspect. They have one of, if not the single worst bot lane in the entire league. I think there's definitely a strong argument to be made in that case, regardless of the fact that Patrick has been better in spring than he was in winter. They probably have the worst mid-jungle duo in the league, especially in terms of actuality and like what they're putting out on the Rift, because Malrang and Larson, while they're good in theory, they're certainly not good in execution at the current moment. And even though Adam is popping off on the top side and having a really good split, all things considered, he's not consistent, and you certainly can't 1v9 in top lane right now, at least not easily, and especially not going into Broken Blade. And so it's just a really difficult matchup for Rogue, and G2 took advantage of it. They're really starting to find their stride in terms of the way they want to play the game, and I think a lot of their players are just getting comfortable, and I think that's the thing I admire about what they're doing the most. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series is, at least to me, very obviously Skumond in the jungle. I know Broadcast or Twitter ended up voting on it being Caps, and I love how Caps especially played that Akali game in game number 2. He was definitely much more of like the flashy main character, like the one kind of taking over, but to me, Skumond set up everything that G2 was doing throughout this entire series, and one of the reasons I really wanted to specify they found their style and they kind of found their groove is because I think they've really gotten comfortable with Skumond playing facilitators and realizing that we can just put him on Maokai and things like Pantheon like more regularly and just allow him to skirmish and play for lanes, and it's gonna really work out. That's what he did on BDS Academy. It's why he was so successful in that role, and obviously he can do that at the LEC level. Every single major game he's had has been on one of these facilitative types of champions. I think that's really where he's going to thrive as a player moving forward, and his tempo was excellent throughout this entire series. Now, Malrang was running it, especially in game number 2, probably the worst he's played on Rogue, and that is certainly a high bar to hit because he's had some really awful games, but Skumond still had to take advantage of that, and I think even a lot of the mistakes that Malrang made were kind of forced on him by Skumond on the other side, so credit to him. He was really good in this series, but I don't want to take anything away from everybody else. Of course, Broken Blade was solid, even with Adam being very good on the other side of this matchup, but Caps got player of the series for a reason on the broadcast because that Akali game was super fun to watch. He teamed up with the Pantheon very well in kind of this macro-dominant duo with the Pantheon Talia and the Galio, of course, on top of that. Even Rakan really plays into that. Of course, you can dive effortlessly with this comp, but you can also dive anywhere at any point. It's very difficult to deal with, especially in the hands of G2, but I think Caps still had to go out there and execute, and with Larson not being active at all, not only in this game, but really in any game, it's really easy for Caps to be able to generate that macro advantage and just kind of be able to take over the map with his jungler. Hansama and Labrov were excellent here. Labrov is really starting to get good again, and I'm really happy about that. I was so high on Labrov last year. He was an MVP finalist for me. He got 3rd in terms of my MVP voting for the entire year for the LEC, and I think he definitely deserved that kind of praise. It just didn't translate in the early part of the year to G2 because they wanted to play a lot more active in the early game than maybe he was comfortable with. Once again, I think this team is just finding their identity, realizing Skumond is better as a facilitator that scales into the late game on things like Maokai. Labrov is better as a team fighter than he is as an early laner, especially in the 2v2, and so we don't need to play against the strengths of the players we brought in. We can allow them to do the things they're good at. Let Labrov play Rakan and Alistar and let him be the primary engage in a lot of these team fights. He doesn't have to be the most active player in the world in the early game. And Hans can play Kaisa, Hans can play Varus. We don't have to put him on Kalista and Draven every single game, even if that is what he is most comfortable with, if it means the betterment of G2. He's flexible enough for you to be able to do that. Caps and Broken Blade can obviously do anything. They can play whatever you need them to, but again, I think G2 is just finding their style, finding their form, and it's working for them. And then for Rogue on the other side, we've already kind of gone over it, but this team really has no direction. They really have no idea what they're trying to do. Adam is sensational, and I will continue to pound the drum for Adam because I really just think he's way too good to be in a position like this. I understand there are off the Rift issues, and there's a reason the BDS wanted to go in a different direction. They wanted to go for someone like Irrelevant in this offseason, but he is still, from a talent perspective, without a doubt, in my opinion, at worst, a top 4 top laner in the LEC. I would still consider him top 3. I love how Oscar Rinnan's been playing. Top 4 is very competitive right now between Kana, Broken Blade, Adam, and Oscar Rinnan. They're the 4 best top laners by a pretty clear margin, but, you know, Adam is in that conversation. He should not be taken out of that conversation just just because he's on a worse team. If he were on one of the teams that those players were on, we would be seeing that version of Adam at the current moment. He's just unfortunately not, and that's just the sad reality. But this mid-jungle duo in particular really let the team down here. Malrang is very easily done of the series. I know some people are going to want to give it to Larson just because he's so inactive and so passive, but that's more narrative-based right now than anything else. Malrang was completely embarrassed in this series, and he has been awful since coming to Rogue, but we could have expected this. His form coming back from the CB LoL last year was not good. He was benched mid-year for a reason in the CB LoL because he just couldn't do anything on that team, and that has translated to Rogue, where he has just been out-jungled by anybody with a pulse at this level. It's not like Patrick and Execute are going to be able to elevate you. I guess the only positive you can say is Patrick isn't solo losing them games like he was in the winter split, so Rogue is still bad, you know, heads up. One win isn't going to completely change my mind on that, but they have pieces. Like, Adam can do a lot of things, and we've seen, you know, Patrick and Larson have good games. I just don't think it's ever going to be consistent, and it's certainly not going to be against G2, who's just way too good of an opponent. Skewmont is really settling in. Labrov is really settling in. That was the only thing holding them back in the winter split. There's a reason this team went back up to number 1 in my power rankings, and this is a big reason why. Then moving on now to day number 2 of our week 3 coverage, and we kicked it off with a top of the table versus bottom of the table clash. SK Gaming taking on K-Corp, and K-Corp predictably once again is going to be able to pick up the win. Very similar to what we talked about previously with G2 versus Rogue. When these really good teams get a chance to kind of showcase their actual skills against the teams that they're way better than, it's pretty fun and it's pretty flashy. There is a lot to like about how K-Corp ended up playing this. Of course, I did drop them down to number 2 last week because of that loss to Fnatic, which obviously is not ideal. You definitely don't like to be in that situation if you're KC, but I still feel like this is clearly a top 2 team in the LEC. I talked about it a bit last week, but that win very much felt like it wasn't repeatable for Fnatic, and I just don't trust that team in the grand scheme of things, and so K-Corp still showcasing that they're one of the best teams in the league, regardless of that loss. For SK, it is very clear their upset win over Fnatic in week number 1 was a fluke, was definitely not something that is particularly repeatable. I think people were coming to pretty gigantic conclusions off of one win that I just was not ready to commit to, and that is unfortunately kind of rung true, we'll just say, over the course of the last couple of weeks. We'll obviously talk about them more, but they got obliterated here. So let's get into it. For K-Corp, player of the series for me is going to go to Vladi in the mid lane. Mini Zeka is kind of what everybody's calling him after this series. I saw it a ton on social media because he played really well on Yone and then had an amazing Akali game in game number 2, right as Zeka is really starting to pop off on those champions once again over in the LCK. I understand why people are saying that considering these performances. I certainly wouldn't say that Vladi and Zeka are built in the same kind of mold. I think Vladi is much more versatile in a playstyle perspective. Not that Zeka is not versatile. Again, I die on the Zeka hill every day of the week if you watch my LCK videos, but I think they're just different players. Vladi is still good at Akali. He's not quite at that level, but yeah, when you're going into Reeker and Bukata and Genax and Loopy, you're going to look pretty darn good if you can get a lead on Akali. It's going to be pretty easy to kind of push your advantage in that case, and that's exactly what he did. He definitely deserved player of the series for me. I think broadcast or Twitter or whoever votes on it voted for Kaliste to get player of the series. I think that's mostly a KDA thing on the 19-0 and 17, and obviously that's super impressive. Going deathless on Kalista and then on Misfortune is a big accomplishment, especially even with a team like SK. You know, they're not the most explosive team in the entire universe, but they can definitely do some things. For him to go deathless, I think, is really impressive at the end of the day, but I would not say that he was the focal point for where this team ended up putting a lot of their resources. I think they played in a couple of different areas outside of that. I really want to shout out Yike. I know we kind of meme on him for being inconsistent, especially on a champion like Vi, and I think First Stand has a lot to do with that, but he was really good in this series, certainly better than Bukata on the other side. Kana continues to be the best top laner in the LEC. He has been for the entirety of this year. He's playing up to his own standard pretty consistently at this point. Really happy to see that consistency is coming around, because he had good performances in 2024. It just wasn't consistent. He would have games where he's solo killing everybody on the top side and then have games where he is completely invisible. For K-Corp, I'm glad to see that the progression he made over the course of summer last year, getting better every single game, has more than carried over into winter and into spring now, where he's just the best top laner in Europe. And then Targamas obviously had some great options, great creation options. He played Fiddlestick support in game number 2. You got to be able to point that out. But K-Corp definitely was fantastic in this series, and this is the kind of dominant win you would expect from one of the teams contending for a title. But once again, it's SK kind of plummeting back down in the standings. I put them back at number 10 after last week. I think I was was a little bit too bullish in putting them up to number 9 after they won one series against Fnatic. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but watching this series, it doesn't even feel like they're on the same planet as K-Corp in terms of their skill level, and, you know, I think we could kind of predict that, and obviously losing to KC isn't the worst thing in the world, but man, they got slaughtered. Like, dud of the series, take your pick, man. It's all 5 of them. Like, genuinely, they were all awful. They all lost in every way you could possibly imagine. Really, the only player I didn't consider was Kadui because I don't think it was his fault. At least he was trying to be aggressive. I didn't really consider Bukata as well. I don't think it was necessarily his mistakes that led to this series being a loss. I'm giving it to GIANTX on the top side because I just can't think of a single play that he made that was even remotely average throughout any of these games. Kana completely abused him on the top side, but Reeker was entirely worse than Vladi in almost every single way. Like, he got obliterated in terms of the macro game and obviously kind of allowed those melee assassins to get out of control. And then Loopy continues to just be unplayable at this level. I'm serious. I think you need to like full commit to just getting rid of him now. Like, your team could actually be kind of interesting. Kadui and, you know, Bukata and even Reeker and GIANTX at times have shown interesting things, but Loopy is not an LEC caliber player, and I think the more he continues to play, the more I'm not going to believe in this team. He doesn't even really have like upside kinds of plays. In their losses, he is just completely and utterly useless. He had one series where he looked like a remotely competent human being, and ever since then, it's been gone. Like, I just don't understand having Loopy on this team, especially with Rahel gone. But overall, SK is unfortunately who we thought they were, at least in this series, and K-Corp, fortunately, is who we thought they were. They continue to look fantastic. Vladi continues to be more of a focal point in terms of where resources are going than he was in Winter. Whether you want to consider that a good or a bad thing, like, they're not playing for bot lane as much as they were in Winter. They're playing much more for mid lane. Top lane, I think, has also taken like a pseudo step back, but K-Corp have shown that they can win through multiple different avenues, and I think that's what makes them so dangerous. But then moving on now to day number 2, and I'm now realizing that I think I said that in the previous segment. If you already typed a comment, you're so stupid that there were 3 series on day number 1. I'm so sorry. I hope you get all the upvotes you deserve because I'm not editing that out, but I appreciate it. Moving on to actual start of day 2, though. It's a matchup between Team Vitality and Fnatic here, and Fnatic is going to pick up the 2-0 victory. Again, not really a shocking outcome. Fnatic should be significantly better than a team like Vitality, but once again, they're winning in a lot of the ways that they ended up winning in the winter split in the regular season, which is this gigantic macro difference. And while I am super impressed by that, and there are moments where it's like, don't give Razork Poppy, that's completely unfair, and we'll talk about that. You just can't give him this champion. Poppy and Ivern are the must bans against Fnatic because they're just going to be able to take over the game on that, and it makes Razork so much more comfortable, but also Humanoid feeling a lot more comfortable going into someone like Chayak, Oscar Renan continuing to play well. So even when Upset's not really doing anything on the bot side, and in fact, not really having that great of a series, you still have a ton to be able to pull from, to be able to win with, because your macro, your baseline is so strong. And for Vitality, like, this is how they've lost all year long. You could have predicted this. Fnatic is a really good team at just being able to out-tempo a lot of teams from ahead, and Vitality has been pulled apart in multiple different games throughout 2025 so far, just because they really aren't that good from a shot calling and a macro perspective. Niski was supposed to come in and fix that, but honestly, Niski was probably the biggest offender of that throughout this entire series. So, of course, we'll get into it, but starting for Fnatic, player of the series is pretty obviously going to go to Razork. The Skarner game was good in game number 1, but watching him play Poppy is like legitimately unfair. He is actually so good at this champion, and Poppy is one of the strongest picks in the meta right now. I don't understand why more people aren't just playing that champion like on InstaClick. I get that, you know, if you draft her too early, then, you know, there's a lot of champions that can actually do a lot into her. But look at this comp from Vitality. This is like the dream, and this is certainly not like a rare comp in terms of the champions that are being picked. So many of the best champions in League of Legends right now are dash merchants, and they kind of need to do that in order to be as useful. And Poppy just immediately shuts that down. And obviously, Poppy is useful in other ways as well. The ultimate can be used very clutch in a lot of team fights to knock a primary damage dealer out of a fight, whether that be Ezreal or Nefiri or whatever. In game number 2, and it's not like she's not one of the biggest tanks in the game if you build her that way. This is a very difficult champion to deal with, and of course Razork is just so comfortable on Poppy that, you know, you can really feel good about playing through the mid game and playing through Razork knowing he's going to be in the right place at the right time, and he knows how to utilize a lot of those resources to their absolute fullest. So credit to Razork, he was excellent here, but how can you not pop off for Humanoid in the back half of game number 2? You know, I'm kind of a Humanoid hater. I'm certainly a Humanoid doubter on this channel. I've been pretty against what he has been for Fnatic, and kind of what Razork has been, quite quite frankly, for Fnatic, where it just feels like no consistency really matters, but the good games are still really good, and it's not like the Yone game was bad. I'm not going to trash the Yone game or anything like that. He was excellent on that champion. Those ultimates were gorgeous, especially the one in the back half of the game, that final fight. It was really beautiful from Humanoid, and when these two are on, they can beat anybody in the LEC. They can compete with anybody in the world. The problem is these two aren't on every single game. They were today, which was important because I don't think Upset had the series of his life. Again, I know the scoreline looks pretty good, but I don't think Upset did a ton throughout this series. Carzzy was super active. This was really the first time we had seen Carzzy kind of awake, in my opinion, in a little while. He's kind of taken more of a backseat role. He's kind of moved away from the feast or famine nature, I'll just say, of his gameplay and moved more into something a bit more stable. I don't know if that's been good or bad for the team, but it certainly hasn't been what we expected out of Carzzy. This was more of the feast or famine nature, and I do think there were times where Carzzy was getting more than Upset in terms of similar situations, which should never happen when your team is winning in the way that Upset's was, but in the end, it didn't really matter. Upset was totally fine in the team fights, and that's really what counts. Oscar Renan continues to be really solid. Mickey was solid, but Razork and Huma are the story for Fnatic. It's not about can they do it in the regular season. It's about can they do it in the playoffs. They still have not proven that that is going to be the case, but again, it's nice to see that they can do it against Vitality. And then for Vitality, I want to reiterate, this is how they've lost all year long. Every single series you can look at for Vitality, almost all of them, their losses have been because they just don't really have any macro. They're not really good at game decisions, especially playing from like a neutral state, and they end up just kind of collapsing in a lot of these circumstances. Niski was brought in to bring a new voice in that department, at least from what we heard. Hylissang didn't necessarily click in terms of the shot calling and the way that they wanted to move forward with like the direction of how they wanted to play their mid games, and so they brought Niski in instead. Niski was bad in this series. He's gonna get done of the series for me. I know some people are gonna defend the Alistair or the Leona games, but I just was not impressed with his lack of tempo, quite frankly, throughout a lot of this. I think he could have done a lot more, especially with Carzzy playing so aggressive. I think following him in a lot of these fights was super important for Niski, and he just wasn't always in the right spot. Now, I'm not blaming him entirely. Like, Chayak was definitely worse than Humanoid. Linsas was definitely worse than Razork on the other side, and those are players that need to be able to step up. I'm still not particularly impressed by Linsas as a jungler. Every major opportunity he's gotten, it's just not looked all that great, in my opinion. Nefiri is a dominant champion, and I get that Poppy really shuts down Vitality's comp, but you need to do better with what you had, and it's not like Knock was popping off. He's probably had a worse spring than he did winter, if only just because he's actually getting exploited a bit more for his greedy decisions. But Vitality's an interesting team. If they can actually start making decisions in the mid game, they're going to become a lot more interesting. For now, they're just one of those teams that's borderline top 6, can be very threatening to deal with, but probably isn't going to have a ton of consistency. And Fnatic is a good team. I just worry about what the ceiling looks like. Again, I'm not going to question Fnatic in these regular season best of 3s. It's all going to be about the playoffs. I trust this team to be able to get the job done now and maybe be first or second in terms of seeding going into playoffs. But after that, you still have no idea what you're going to get out of this team. Then moving on to our second series of day number 2, and again, this one's actually kind of a good one. I was really excited for this. It was Movistar KOI taking on Team BDS, and KOI is going to dominate this series, but this illuminates a lot for me when it comes to the difference between the best and the mediocre teams in this region. We have been talking about a top 4 all year long, but if there was ever proof that there is a top 4, it's this series, where I just don't think anybody outside of that top 4, anyone in the bottom 6, can compete with anyone in the top 4. Even KOI, who I think is struggling and doesn't have like the perfect synergy in terms of the players on their team. They have some things that I think I am worried about moving forward. They are leaps and bounds better than the teams that are trying to fight out for that number 4 spot. And BDS looked good coming into this week. Obviously, they had a terrible week, all things considered, and a lot went wrong for them even in this series, but KOI is really good, and you have to be a good team to be able to win in the way that they did. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me, very difficult, very up in the air. It should go to one of Mirwin or Elyoya. I settled on Elyoya for that Xin Zhao game in game number 2. 113 had no way to be able to play that out on the Zyra, and that was really impressive to me. Mirwin decimated the top lane matchup, and we'll get into that more in a bit, but Elyoya getting back into form is just so relevant. It's just so important for KOI overall, because without Elyoya playing well, this team honestly isn't particularly great. Like, they're good. They're certainly better than most other teams in the LEC, but Elyoya and Jojo Pune specifically being together as a duo in the middle of the map is what takes KOI from being like the clear 4th best team, like a full tier down from anyone in the top 3, to a team that could compete for top 2, that certainly could compete for an MSI spot if everything were to go right. And now Yoya has been in form in the last couple of weeks. He really wasn't in winter. Him and Jojo Pune started out really slow. It felt like both of them really wanted a lot of the resources and neither were willing to compromise all that much. That led to Jojo not playing well, and it led to Yoya trying to compensate and by, proxy also not playing well, and that really hurt KOI in the playoffs. But now that we're getting into spring, it does feel like this team has developed more of an identity, again, more of a concrete way that they want to give resources to multiple members of this team, whether it be Jojo Pune, who obviously got a lot of them in winter, or now like Mirwin, who has been playing excellent across 2025 so far, and then Supa and Alvaro, who are still one of the best bot lanes in the league. They're just playing like perma weak side on KOI for this team. Like, I think they've just gotten better at being able to allocate those resources, which has helped, and Yoya has been the biggest reason for that. Things like Ivern make a lot of sense for this team. Even Xin Zhao, it creates these opportunities for everybody to be able to fight all the time, and that's what KOI is good at, just playing to your strengths, and that's what they did here. Again, 113 had no shot. Mirwin destroyed Irrelevant on the top side, and I was a Mirwin hater last year. I definitely stand by the comments I made in 2024, and some of that still does apply, where it's like, is this guy even good at top laners? Like, can he even play Cassante or Mbessa or Gwen or anything like that? Like, is he even going to be able to pilot those at a remotely average level? Because quite frankly, in 2024, he wasn't. Like, even the Cassante, which was considered to be his best like meta top laner, was still not particularly good for him. He was only really popping off and dominating in a lot of those games when he got the weird picks, but pulling out the Varus once again here dominates the Rumble. But it's the Gwen game in game number 2 that continues to give me a ton of confidence. Not only that, but he was really good on things like Cassante and Mbessa early on in the year, even when the rest of the team was struggling. I would argue Mirwin's maybe been the best player on KOI so far in 2025, and that's just a really good sign. Again, he continues to get better. Irrelevant is a complete pushover on the top side at this point, but at least we saw some good things from Mirwin. Supa goes deathless. That's awesome. Really happy for him. He was playing a little bit safer. Again, he's kind of perma weak side on the bot lane right now, just because that's the way that KOI want to play, but he's fine in that role. He can definitely operate there. Alvaro was very active moving around the map, was involved in basically every play that happened, but him and Yoya are really starting to get back into the groove they had, especially at the beginning of the year in 2024. Really excited to see if that can grow. Jojo was fine in the mid lane, if not a bit over-eager at times, but KOI is finally starting to find their groove, and again, that's what matters. If Mirwin can start taking over, and specifically, if it stops feeling like there's too many cooks in the kitchen, I think things are going to get better for this team. But for BDS on the other side, it's just the new recruits, the new players on BDS that are just not living up to the hype at the current moment. It's hard to get a real grasp on where Paris is at. I don't really blame him, because it really doesn't feel like any of the things that are going wrong are his fault right now, but 113 and Irrelevant were awful this week, and Nuke, I think for the first time, maybe all year, just really let this team down in terms of being able to survive in the mid lane matchup. And if that's going to be the case, if Nuke's not winning in mid lane, BDS is screwed. This team has no way to win, because he really has been their anchor point throughout all of this year. He's been their MVP kind of player, and without him, they're nowhere close to top 5. Like, they are a bottom 2 team if Nuke is playing poor, and that's kind of what we saw here. 113 is just out of form. Like, again, this guy feels so feast or famine. I really like the tools and the mechanics that he has, and he's shown really good things at this level. It felt like he was finally getting into form in week 1, week 2. It felt like the beginning of spring. It was like clicking for him mentally, but that all washed away here in week 3, where he got demolished in 2 straight series. But Irrelevant's the bigger problem for me, because he is just not playable. At least 113 has shown upside in terms of the games that are happening right now. I can't give you a single Irrelevant game that's even been passable in 2025. He has been the worst player on BDS by a large margin, and he's right down there, like, shockingly, with players like GIANTX for being the worst top laner in the LEC. Even GIANTX has probably had more highs. His lows have just been lower. Like, Irrelevant, what good play has Irrelevant made in 2025? I genuinely can't recall anything that even comes to mind, which is just not really a good place to be. Mirwin embarrassed him on the top side here, and I'm honestly just done with him. I was already kind of lower on him coming into the year. Anybody who watched last year's content kind of knows that I was super out on like the Irrelevant number 1 or number 2 top laner hype until a lot of the top laners left. He was number 2 for me coming into the year, because I just didn't know what else we were going to get out of a lot of these other players. But, Kana is better than him. Oscar Rinnan is better than him. Mirwin is better than him. Obviously Broken Blade is better than him. Like every top laner you can think of, Adam is better than him, and they had Adam on this team. This was a gigantic swing and miss in free agency for BDS, and I think they're really paying for it. Nuke didn't play well, but it's probably the first time in a while he hasn't played well. I'm going to cut him a bit of slack. Ice is starting to be at least a little bit more stable, but this team is kind of a disaster right now, and there's a lot going wrong. That being said, Are they definitely not a top 6 team? No, like they still absolutely could be a top 6 team because Nuke is good enough to be able to beat a lot of the lower tier teams, but with their loss to Team Heretics, that puts them in a bit of a prickly position, and again, with everything being so wide open, you know, it's going to be hard, like you have to cement your claim, but teams like Vitality, teams like GIANTX, teams like Heretics, that's who you're going up against right now, and are they definitely worse than those teams? It's just hard for me to say that they are, so even with all the negativity, there is still some positivity to take away, but for KOI, this is a really nice win. Again, I still feel like they're the clear number 4, but maybe they're getting better, and maybe at some point they can, you know, emerge into that top 3, even top 2 to try to compete for an MSI spot. We know they're talented enough to do that. It's all just about whether or not they can put it together. But that's going to bring us to our third and final day of action here in the LEC in week number 3. And a little bit of an upset here as we saw GIANTX taking on SK Gaming. And I kind of begrudged this earlier, but SK Gaming is going to pick up the victory here 2-0. They're going to be the better team by a decently considerable margin. I guess Jackie's at times made this interesting, but even Jackie's was really messing up a lot. Lot had a pretty decent series, but SK was better here. And you know, I kind of sold this earlier when I talked about just how bad SK was as a team, and I'm like, oh, I just, you know, I was so smart for putting them down at number 10, and, you know, I knew that the win over Fnatic was a fluke, and here they are just beating up on GIANTX, who feels entirely lost. Like, there is just no other way to say it. This team has absolutely no momentum, nothing really going for them at the moment. It feels like nobody except for 1 or 2 players at any given time can even be playable at the LEC level. Noah and Jun have been able to carry them for a lot of this year, and Jackie's at times has stepped up. Lot at times has had some good games, and, you know, obviously, you know, they didn't choose to move on from closer. He wanted to step away from competitive. He wanted to step away from the team, but this team is just in disarray in terms of finding any sense of consistency, and I just don't really know where they're going from this point onwards. So we'll talk about that again when we get to GX, but starting with SK, 2 players here absolutely dominated and popped off, and they were GenX and they were Kadui, and I'm so happy to be able to say that because we've been kind of waiting on that performance from one of Kadui or Bukata to really be like, this is the guy. Even in that series that they won against Fnatic, it really felt like Reeker was the one to cause a lot of the havoc in terms of being able to move around the map and create a lot for SK. This was the series where it's like, I'm Kadui and I'm going to be a good enough AD carry to take over this league. Like, I've deserved to be in the LEC for a little while. I'm sure he was frustrated seeing basically, well, not basically, every single one of his teammates from last year get called up to the LEC in the offseason, and he was not going to be a part of that. I'm sure that there was some resentment in that regard, but finally getting the opportunity here on SK mid-year, he is making the most of it. I do think there are still a lot of areas for him to improve, but Noah and Jun are certainly not pushovers in terms of the bot lane on the other side of this argument, on the other side of this matchup, and Kadui was easily, in my opinion, the best player on the Rift. I say easily, it's not like GenX played bad at all. He picks up the Varus top lane that we just saw as a counter pick in the previous series with Movistar KOI, and he uses it to perfection. Again, GenX needs to start taking advantage of what he is actually good at as a player, which is winning lane. He's really not a team fighter. He's really not even a mid-game player. You don't want him going neutral on the top side because he doesn't do nearly as well with neutral resources as a lot of other top laners are going to, but he is a pretty good laner. He's always been a pretty good laner, and so if you can get him into these counter matchups on the top side, all of a sudden I think things do open up for SK and things do become a little bit easier. So nice to see GenX pop off. I think people are going to overhype this and talk about how GenX has actually been good all year long for this team and has been held down. His stats would indicate that. I certainly don't think the eye test would indicate that. He is useless in team fights when he is not like super far ahead in gold, but there is definitely still something there. You know, Reeker and Bukata were fine. I don't think they were perfect. In fact, I think Jackie's did a lot of heavy lifting in this series more than he's going to get credit for. And obviously Loopy had some good moments, a couple of good engages. I'm still not sold on him being like an actual LEC caliber player, but he can have LEC caliber moments on champions like Rel and Rakan, especially when his Kai'Sa is completely popping off. So congratulations to SK. This is a nice victory. You got more than one this split. I think that's already a positive. And then for GX on the other side, it's obviously really disappointing to see how this split has gone. They came into this split with so much excitement, at least for me. I thought they were going to be the best of the rest. I had them at number 5 in my power rankings heading into this split. They are clearly not the number 5 team in the power rankings. They just lost to SK. They've been on a losing streak, and this team is kind of crumbling in a lot of different areas. How bad are they? It's hard for me to really tell because right now Isma is playing the worst league he's ever played. He's going to get dead of the series. I see a lot of big claims on social media. Some of them I agree with. He got worse over the course of last year, and I think that some of that has bled into this year, and I think once again it is kind of happening. The story of 2024 Isma on SK Gaming was he was pretty okay. In fact, pretty good in winter when he first joined the team, that first split last year, and then in spring it got worse, and in summer it got really bad, where he just was not very good for the team. And now, you know, on SK in winter, this split in 2025, or this year in 2025, he plays well in winter and he gets replaced. I wouldn't say well. He was one of the more productive players on the team, we'll just say, in winter when everything was going wrong for SK, ends up getting replaced, partly rightfully so, because Bukata's an interesting player, but certainly an interesting change at the very least. He ends up, you know, going to GX after some drama with KC Blue and, you know, obviously all of that stuff, and he's been awful in the spring split for GX. He's been unplayable in the jungle for them. It just feels like this is going to continue to be a trend where he's okay in winter at the start of the year when teams are a little bit less coordinated, but once they can start taking him out of his comfort zone, and certainly once teams start respecting his tape a little bit more and just realizing that they can shut him down early, he can't really do anything after that, I think he's going to struggle. Like, as long as teams target his weaknesses are still too big, and they continue to be a massive problem. But he wasn't the only player who played bad here. Noah had a really bad series, and I think it's going to go a bit under the radar. Kadui outplayed him in basically every avenue that was even possible for an AD carry, and I hate saying that because, again, I'm a big fan of Noah. I'm an even bigger fan of Jun in terms of how he's played over the course of this year, and neither of them looked competent, really, in this series against SK, where they kind of needed to step up. I think if Noah and Jun had been the better bot lane in this series, I think GX win it. I think they have more than enough pressure elsewhere, even with Isma kind of running it in the jungle, for them to be able to win this series, but that was not the case. Again, Jackie's made some mistakes here, some definite positioning errors, like flashing on Ari to miss a charm. It's really not ideal in terms of how he was playing the game, but at least he was trying to do something, and I don't think Lot was the problem. GX just don't have the firepower. They certainly don't have the consistency to be able to overcome their own problems, and even SK is a good enough team to be able to take advantage of that. Does that mean that SK is better than the worst team in the league? Probably. Like, Kadui alone probably has enough promise to put this team out of number 10, but I still don't believe in them. Like, are they a top, 8 or 7 team? I don't know. Like, that's still hard for me to say. Are they even better than GX? Would I expect, SK to beat GX more than 6 times out of 10 if they were to play best of 3s? I don't know. Like, it's just hard for me to say that because their tape outside of this series, and I guess outside of the Fnatic series, look bad, but those are 2 series where they did play well, and honestly, there is enough tape to kind of consider them interesting. So, a lot to ponder when it comes to SK's overall impact on the league this year, but definitely makes things a lot more interesting to see them competitive. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here in the LEC in week number 3, and it was a matchup between Team Heretics and Corp, and Corp is going to pick up the win, but are they really going to pick up the win in this series? This was unbelievable to watch. This is the creme de la creme of best of 3s, where it's just absolute chaos. Is it top tier gameplay? Absolutely not, although there were times where Heretics played incredibly well in this series, but was it a banger? Absolutely. Did Corp feel like the better team today? No, they absolutely did not. I think I can say that with my full chest. I really do not believe that Corp was the better of these 2 teams here today, but Team Heretics just don't have the ability to close it out. A couple of small mistakes down the stretch for Carlson, for Kamalu. They end up really costing the team, and that gives Corp just enough firepower to be able to get themselves across the finish line, but you gotta give it up to Heretics. This was a phenomenal effort from them, and I'm gonna highlight them very heavily in this segment. But starting with Corp here, player of the series for me is gonna go to Kaliste. I'm gonna be honest, throughout this series, he was really the only one I felt consistently good about, even with a lot of the good score lines coming in from Corp elsewhere. I think the only positive is that Kaliste was given the opportunity to take over the game in games 2 and 3. I think he was given the chance to be able to play. I think there is some conversation that he should not have been given that chance, that Carlson or Kamalu or Sheo should have been a bit more aggressive, that Stend, if he got a couple of more stacks on the Senna in the back half of the game, could have made things a little bit more difficult, could have probably won that game for Team Heretics, but Kaliste was indeed able to play. He was able to press his buttons and to right-click on people, and he did enough damage to be able to take over. He's really good at being able to play front to back. I didn't expect him to be able to do it, but he did get the job done here, so credit to him, but I cannot credit everybody else on Corp. I can't even really credit Kaliste entirely, because, the fact that he got to play was more against, Team Heretics than it was for Corp, even if he did well with the resources he got. The rest of this Corp team was just making bad decisions. Their early games, tragically bad. Yes, they were good in the late game here, and they were able to pull back a lot of resources because of that, but they were not winning in lane. They were not making good decisions early. They were hemorrhaging resources throughout this series, and to me, dud of the series is Yike on the winning side here. I don't really do this all that much. I'm gonna be entirely real with you guys. We'll get to the Team Heretics section in a little bit. I considered giving player of the series to Stend because he really was that good for Heretics on the other side. I do think he was probably the best player on the Rift in this series, but I just couldn't justify taking it away from Kaliste, if only because not only was he the most important player on the team that ended up winning, but he did step up when it mattered. But man, dud of the series, yeah, it's staying on K-Corp. I did not have to consider that. Nobody on Heretics was getting dud of the series here. They simply were too good and too important to the game overall. But yikes, early games, what was happening? Like, he just lost tempo way too quickly. You can blame Kana for not being in a good spot against Carlson in basically any of the 3 games. You can blame Targamas for being way too far forward, even in situations where they're playing Ashe Lulu bot lane. Like, I get it's double marksman here, and you've got a Lilia and things like that, so Lulu does have a lot of value, but I just don't really like the circumstance set up here by K-Corp. Like, you can blame those guys, but I think Yike's inability to control tempo in the early game was kind of a problem for this team. Again, if you wanted to put more pressure and more negativity on the solo laners or the laners in general, I think that that's entirely fair, and I think that would be accurate to the overall game, but I certainly wasn't giving dud of the series to anybody on Heretics. Again, I just think they were too good, but K-Corp still have a lot to work on. I'm gonna chalk this up to a game being a little bit more for fun, like them maybe not taking Heretics as seriously, or maybe Heretics just stepping up and playing really well in this one. I'm not gonna sit here and freak out over K-Corp's underperformance here and all of a sudden rank them below, you know, Fnatic and Movistar KOI. It feels kind of unfair or unrealistic to do that, you know, project that moving forward, but there certainly were some concerning traits, and that's definitely worth pointing out. But for Heretics on the other side, they played awesome here. They absolutely should have won this series. Everyone stepped up and everyone played their role. Their early games were genuinely terrific, and honestly, some of their team fights were really gorgeous as well. Like I said, I really considered Stend for player of the series. He was phenomenal in this series on all 3 of their picks, on the Rakan in game 1, on the Gragas in game number 2, and on the Senna in game number 3. He was the most important player on the map for a lot of this series. And again, if you want to give him player of the series, and if you just want to say, you know, K-Man, you're being a little bit too scared to give it to a player on the losing side, be my guest, man, because he was truly exceptionally good, and I think he earned it. I do want to shout out, you know, Carlson and Kamalu. Did they kind of sprint it in the back half of game number 3? Yes, I do think that there were a couple of over-eager plays that they ended up making that really cost their team. And again, this is just kind of the youthful inexperience that leads to some mistakes in the back half. I think they will grow out of this, but man, they got some leads in their individual lanes. Like, Kamalu was better in lane than Vladi, and Carlson was definitely better in lane than Kana, and these are arguably some of the 2 best solo laners in the entire league. I don't even think it's arguable. These are 2 of the best solo laners in the entire league, in Kana and Vladi on the other side, so that's gigantic. Flakked continues to be really excellent for this team as a late game carry. He just wasn't given someone to pop off with in game 3. Sheo was totally fine as a setup man. His facilitation throughout this series was excellent, and his early games were really good. Team Heretics just played really well, and again, I'm making the argument that they were better today than K-Corp was. They just weren't able to walk away with the victory, and that's gonna sting, but there's so much to build off of here, and I think this team might be better than I'm giving them credit for. And then for KC on the other side, I don't want to freak out over them underperforming. They still were able to walk out of this with a win, which at the end of the day is what really matters. In the end, you know, the record matters, and being able to get there consistently matters, but there are concerning traits with this team. I just am willing to take this more as a Heretics plus than a K-Corp minus and walk away knowing that this was a really fun banger to end the week. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LEC Week 3 overview and analysis video here in the Spring Split. Up on the screen, the updated standings after 3 weeks of action. Again, apologies for getting this out after day number 1 of Week 4. I really am trying my best. You definitely got to understand, but we can talk about the standings at the end of Week 3 and just kind of where my thoughts are on a lot of these teams. We still have a lot to talk about with them. You can see my personal power rankings to the right of each of those teams from number 1 to number 10 and how they have changed from last week to this week. I think a lot of people are going to disagree with the power rankings this week because I honestly just don't know where to put a lot of these teams, and so I'm staying relatively cautious in terms of a lot of the changes that I'm making. First off, top 4 is not moving at all, even with K-Corp looking a little bit more up and down, losing to Fnatic last week. I still think K-Corp will be better than Fnatic when it matters the most as we get into the playoffs, and so K-Corp stays at 2, Fnatic stays at 3, and it's not like K-Corp didn't go 2-0 this week, even with that game, or that series against Team Heretics, so top 4 staying the same, at least for now, but everybody else moving in some way, shape, or form, swapping one spot with somebody else. Moving up to 5, Vitality, who lost this week in very convincing fashion. How are they moving up, you might ask? Well, everybody else below them looked even worse than they did, in my opinion, or have looked worse than them consistently over the past couple of weeks, and so somehow I think Vitality is probably the 5th best team in the LEC, even though they got macro masterclassed by Fnatic. At least they have some mechanics that you can rely on, but BDS is only going to fall to 6. I think there's going to be some people that put them even lower than this, and honestly, I can't even really, argue with that. Right now, they were going into this week top 5, 2-1 for me. They dropped to 2-3 in terms of their series score after this week, and there are some real concerns with where they are at, but it's just hard for me to believe that they are consistently worse than the teams below them, although Heretics is certainly making things interesting. They're going to move up to number 7. I still have a hard time predicting that they're going to be able to make the playoffs at this current rate, but I definitely think it's more possible now than it's ever been before. They are clearly better than a lot of the teams near the bottom, and if they were top 6, better than BDS or better than Vitality, I'm really not going to be all that surprised. Hell, they could be the 5th best team in the LEC right now. That's really not out of the realm of possibility. They looked like the 5th best team in the LEC across this week. It's just really hard to say that form is going to keep itself up. If they do it for more than 1 week, I'll start to consider it, but for now, again, I'm going to be relatively cautious because it did kind of come out of nowhere in my opinion. For Team Heretics, GIANTX is going to fall to number 8. Some people are going to have them a lot lower than this because they did lose to SK Gaming, so putting them in the bottom 2, kind of a fair call right now. I just think they have a more talented roster, and as much as I do think that GIANTX is doing a lot of bad things, I just don't trust SK like that, so they're only moving up to number 9. Rogue is going to be number 10. This team is not good. They're going to have a hard time winning if they don't, basically get free resources from their opponent, even with Adam being really good on the top side, so felt pretty good about Rogue at 10, but if you wanted SK at 8 and GIANTX at, 9, that's totally fine. If you wanted SK at 7, BDS at 8, and GIANTX at 9, in terms of the form we saw specifically in week number 3, like, that would probably be an accurate assessment. I just don't project that to be the case moving forward. So these are my power ranking updates. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with. Do you think I should change more? Do you think it's okay to be a little bit more cautious about regular season performances in the LEC because they've been so volatile over the course of the last few years? I'm curious to know what your thoughts and opinions are down below, but let's go ahead and move into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 3. Player of the week for me is going to go to Kaliste, the AD carry for K-Corp. K-Corp had some ups and downs, but Kaliste was not part of the ups and downs. He was just an up throughout a majority of this week. He is the reason they beat Team Heretics and were able to walk out of that series with the win. The Kaisa game and game number 2 being the one that I highlighted here, but the whole series really looking very nice from Kaliste. And then, of course, he decimated SK Gaming, as did the entirety of K-Corp earlier on in the week. Specifically, that Misfortune game was absolutely devastating, but it's not like the Kalista was any worse in that game number 1, so he definitely is more than deserved that player of the week. But my honorable mentions: Razork, the jungler for Fnatic, a Poppy masterclass, and really just a macro masterclass playing from ahead for him, and then another jungler in Elyoya, another Spanish jungler in Elyoya for Movistar KOI being the other honorable mention. Again, he just had some fantastic games, specifically that Xin Zhao game in game number 2 that really felt dominant. I really wanted to highlight these two junglers, even though they only played 1 series this week. It really did feel like they stepped up. If you wanted a Team Heretics representative, Flakked was definitely in consideration as an honorable mention this week, but I settled on Elyoya and Razork, and then Kaliste as my player of the week. And then my dud of the week is pretty obviously going to go to Irrelevant. This either should be Irrelevant or 113. It has to be one of those two. One of the topside members of BDS has to be getting dud of the week here because they just were both awful across both of their series. There's just no justification for how they played over the course of week number 3, and both of them need to be better if this team wants to get anywhere near what their expectations are. Again, this is supposed to be a pretty clear top 5 team, and they are nowhere near that caliber right now. They can't compete with KOI, as they showed. They can't really compete even with the teams that are around them. They lost to Heretics at the beginning of the week, which is really not a great result. So overall, Irrelevant, pretty easy choice for dud of the week, and then of course Kaliste is my player of the week. But that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be covering the rest of the LEC on this channel, the regular season and the playoffs, but we also cover the LTA North, the LCK, and the LPL every single week, as well as the NACL Tier 2 over in North America. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. However, I do also want to give one small shout out at the end here. I will be live tonight if you're watching this on release, like basically 1 or 2 hours after this video goes out. I will be live on the LPL English YouTube and Twitch channels as a color commentator for the LNG Esports versus Ultra Prime series tonight. So if you're interested in checking that out, links to that will obviously be in the description. If you're seeing this a day late or a couple of days later, whatever, the VOD will obviously be on the channels as well in the description if you're interested in checking that out. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all